Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. Like me, my guest today, Joshua Keating, loves maps. His new book, Invisible Countries: Journeys to the Edge of Nationhood, is about borders we see on maps and the borders we don't see. Josh Keating is a longtime foreign affairs journalist and now editor at Slate, and in this book he takes readers to places that are not quite countries. This includes places like Abkhazia, Somaliland, and the Akwesasne nation between New York and Ontario. He makes the argument that we are currently in a period of what he calls cartographical stasis. That is, we are in an era in which not many new countries are being created, at least compared to other eras of recent history, though, he posits, this period may be coming to an end. I first got wind of Josh's new book when I read an article he wrote about a soccer tournament for countries that are not quite countries. Think of it as the World Cup, but for quasi countries. And this book kicks off by referencing this tournament, so that is where we begin our conversation at the CONIFA World Cup in Abkhazia. Before we begin, a big thank you to everyone who is leaving reviews of the podcast on iTunes. I so appreciate the support. Leaving a review is a great way to help the show because it encourages other people to subscribe to it, which in turn helps us grow and attract advertisers and become a more powerful force for social change and awareness in the world, which is what this is all about. All right, now here is my conversation with Joshua Keating, author of the new book Invisible Countries and journalist at Slate.
It's the World Football Cup. It's a somewhat derivative name.
Yes, not the FIFA World Cup.
No, it's sponsored by a group called CONIFA, the Confederation of Independent Football Associations, which is basically a group for countries, using that term broadly, that can't get membership in FIFA. So most of these are either unrecognized states or kind of sub-national ethnic groups that want to start a national team, but aren't the kind of places that you see either with seats at the United Nations or as the opening ceremonies at the Olympics or at the World Cup.
Yeah, I remember reading a magazine article you wrote about this event and getting really excited for the book that was going to sort of feature some of that reporting. So I was glad to have your book land in my mailbox. So so set the scene for this soccer event in Abkhazia.
Yes.
What is Abkhazia? Who attended? How did you get there?
So this was in the summer of 2016, and it was the second time this event had been held. And this was the first time it was actually held on the territory of an unrecognized country. Abkhazia is a breakaway region of Georgia, which has been sort of semi-autonomous since a civil war in the early 1990s. It's currently recognized only by Russia and a handful of other countries, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Nauru, and I think now Syria a few weeks ago recognized it. So pretty much either countries that have a problem with U.S. foreign policy or kind of selling their recognition to the highest bidder. But yeah, so getting there is a little tricky. I went through Georgia, which meant flying to Tbilisi and then taking a train to this border town. And then you get to the border and there's a Georgian police checkpoint, which they insist on not calling a border.
I remember that. I went to Georgia in 2012 and I kept referring, and we went to South Ossetia the border of it. And I kept calling it border and they kept correcting me and saying, no, it's a boundary they had some term, but they definitely did not want me to use the word border in describing it.
Yeah, it's not a border, but for some reason they check your passport when you go through it. But so after you cross the Georgian police checkpoint, this kind of no man's land, where you walk about a kilometer on this road that no one's really maintaining because neither country is taking responsibility for it, and there are no cars allowed on the road. So there's actually horse-drawn carts that you can hire to take your luggage back and forth, and then you get to the other side, and it's the borders patrolled by the FSB, the successor, Russian domestic security, the successor to the KGB, and then you're in Abkhazia, which, when you're there, despite the Russian military presence, which is palpable, feels very much like an independent country. I mean, I think internationally, and especially in Washington, we tend to just refer to Abkhazia and South Ossetia as Russian-occupied territory in Georgia. But when you're there, it definitely has the feeling of an independent, autonomous, political unit, despite the Russian presence. And the event was a really kind of amazing spectacle. I spent most of my time with the team from Somaliland, which is another semi-independent country that I traveled to later. But there were teams from Kurdistan, from northern Cyprus, and then a few from places that aren't even really trying to be independent. There was Padania, which is northern Italy. There was Rhaetia, which is the Romansh-speaking region of Switzerland. So there's really kind of a range of the type of nations, in quotes, that were represented here, but it was really kind of places that don't really kind of fit into the normally recognized club of 193 or 194 countries that we usually think of.
So what does this soccer tournament tell you about the state of nationhood, of countryship, if that's a word, in the world today?
I mean, FIFA is kind of a weird organization because there are a lot of members of it that actually aren't UN member states, but
like England.
Yeah, England, Palestine now is, Kosovo is. So there are some controversial members of FIFA as well. But still, I mean, I think that in general, these kind of big athletic events, the Olympics in particular, kind of represent our sort of traditional view of the map of the world. And what I liked about CONIFA is, whatever your opinion is on any of the territorial disputes that these countries are involved in, it kind of represented a kind of alternative history of the map of the world, that that it's not outlandish to think that if a couple of revolutions or peace treaties or civil wars had gone differently, that we could have an independent Kurdistan, or Italy as it currently exists could be multiple countries. And whereas a place like Pakistan or Switzerland could be this kind of fanciful notion that it seems like an absurd fantasy of nationalists or irredentists or what have you. So I kind of liked that aspect of it, that it was this kind of alternative history version of the World Cup.
So one of the central ideas in your book is that we've been in this period of what you call cartographical stasis. Can you explain what you mean by that term?
Yeah, so basically it refers to the slowdown in the creation of new countries. In the 21st century, there have been only 3 newly independent countries that have become UN member states. That's Kosovo, Montenegro, and South Sudan. And then, I'm sorry, East
Timor, yeah.
Yeah, let me take that back. In the 21st century, there are only 3 newly independent countries that have become UN member states. That's East Timor, Montenegro, and South Sudan. There's also Kosovo, although that has not yet joined the UN because of Russian opposition. And this is a big contrast to what we saw in most of the second half of the 20th century, when you saw the decline of the European overseas empires, where we saw dozens of new countries being created in Africa and Asia primarily, and what you saw in the 1990s with the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of Yugoslavia and their reunification of Germany. And if you look at kind of what international affairs theorists were writing in sort of 92, 93, you saw a lot of concern that that trend was just going to continue. There's going to be this sort of endless breakup of existing countries into these ethnic subunits. And there's just going to be this massive cause of global instability, as every people in the world wanted to start its own country, and that it hasn't really happened that way. I mean, the world's borders have become relatively fixed in place, and there's a lot of sort of hostility toward new independence movements and toward the creation of new countries, as we saw last year in the case of both Iraqi Kurdistan and Catalonia. There really isn't a lot of support anywhere in the world for these new places that want to be independent states, even when in the Kurdish state they may have a lot of political support for their kind of semi-independence.
It is also, I think it's probably worth emphasizing just like how widespread this belief was in like the late 90s, at least when I was kind of coming of age intellectually and starting to read books about nationalism, how pretty much everyone thought there would just be more and more smaller countries based in around just like ethnic nationalism around the world than there ended up turning out to be.
Yeah, and that's continued. It wasn't even just in the 90s. I mean, I can remember after the independence of South Sudan in 2010, us running articles at Foreign Policy predicting that, the map of Africa is now up for grabs, that there's going to be this sort of scramble of independence movements. And, it seemed every 5 years or so, when there's sort of a new phase of conflict in the Middle East, we see the same round of think pieces about the end of Sykes-Picot, which was it's sort of used as shorthand for the borders that were drawn in the Middle East after World War I. And you know what? Those borders are looking pretty durable. I mean, we can talk about the extent to which they actually correspond with realities on the ground, or whether they matter. But despite ISIS, despite the conflict in Yemen, despite Kurdish nationalism, I mean, those borders in the Middle East are looking pretty robust. It doesn't seem like we're actually going to see a sort of reparceling of territory anytime soon.
So why is that? Why is it the case that these borders are so durable?
Yeah, well, I think that there was actually, I think the trend actually sort of started after World War I, when you saw the kind of initial breakup of European empires, and when Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which sort of proclaimed that nations should be reapportioned along the basis of sort of ethnic nationality rather than sort of imperial power politics, and that sort of obviously took a while to take hold, and didn't, in Europe for quite a long time didn't actually look like that. But I think there was this idea in the 20th century that the sort of creation of new states based on the breakup of these big European empires was natural and a good thing, but that sort of further divisions wouldn't be tolerated. I mean, you can look at the charter of the African Union, which is an organization that was basically set up specifically to combat and overcome the legacies of European colonialism. But in its charter, it has language saying that the borders that existed upon independence will not be further divided. And it's a little strange, because what could be a more significant vestige of colonialism than the actual shape of the countries of Africa? But it makes some sense. I mean, countries that don't want to normalize secessionism, generally countries that have their own secessionist movements they're worried about. And that's the kind of cynical way of looking at it. But also, if you look at the kind of wars over territory that were fought in the 20th century and the kind of relative decline of interstate conflict, there's sort of a case to be made for leaving borders as they are. The number of sort of peaceful national breakups of peaceful secessions is pretty short. Czechoslovakia or Scandinavia maybe, but those are exceptions. I mean, I think cases like Yugoslavia or like the partition of India, where the redrawing of territory leads to either border conflicts or ethnic cleansing as people find themselves on the wrong sides of the new borders that are drawn, that tends to be a lot more common.
Yet, in your book, you suggest that this period of cartographical stasis. I love that term, by the way. May be coming to an end.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a question that I'm really leave open, I'd say. That there's clearly like around during the period I was writing this book, I think you saw the pressures on the world map really growing. I mean, I pitched the original idea for this like around the time of the annexation of Crimea, around the time of the secessionists fighting in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, the rise of ISIS. I mean, and the kind of creation of the Islamic State as a kind of proto-state straddling borders in the Middle East. If you looked at China's island building in the South China Sea, so there were all these kind of pressures on the existing world map. But I actually think, like, maybe even since the time I started writing about it, I've started to think that the world map may be a little more durable than I even thought. That I think that give or take a few minor island states here and there, that I don't really foresee major territorial adjustments, at least in the next few years.
So Somaliland will not be a newly independent nation and member of the UN anytime soon?
I don't think so.
Wait, can you talk about Somaliland? I mean, it's some really
Yeah,
interesting reporting you did in the book from Somaliland.
Somaliland's a fascinating place. Its independence also dates back to this period I've been talking about in the early 90s, when the world map looked kind of up for grabs. And what's fascinating about Somaliland, I think, is that we tend to talk about the borders of Africa as these colonial constructs, and these nationalist movements trying to reassert ethnic identity as the basis of countries. But what the Somalilanders actually want to do is redraw the colonial boundaries. This is the territory that was British Somaliland, and the rest of what we know as Somalia was an Italian colony. And when the two British Somaliland was an independent, internationally recognized state for about a week until they joined up with their fellow Somalis and created the country we know as Somalia today. And then, when fighting really got bad in the 80s and 90s, they split off, and it's become this kind of island of stability almost. It's they are, according to Freedom House, they are partly free. They're the only country in the area that gets that designation. There's relatively little violence. There's almost no terrorist activity. They've recently had this sort of border conflict with this one group that wants to rejoin the rest of Somalia, which I write about a bit in the book. But all told, you have to count it as at least a relative success story compared to the rest of Somalia, but it is not recognized by a single other country. And it's a very strange place when you go there because it's, they have their own flag, they have their own passports. When you go there, your passport's stamped by a official from the government of Somaliland. You go and meet ministers from Somaliland, and you kind of forget while you're there that you're in an unrecognized country and a place that, according to the rest of the world, doesn't even exist.
And it's basically like the western part of Somalia, right?
Yes, exactly. And it has a sort of interesting relationship with Ethiopia, which kind of has sort of heavy economic ties and investment in Somaliland, even while not formally recognizing it. And it's actually, compared to some of the other places I went to, is fairly easy to get to. There are regular flights there from Dubai, and it's pretty straightforward to get there. Some of the other places I went,
because it is like so stable.
yeah, it is, and yeah, and I should note, even like since the time I wrote the book, there've been some emerging troubles there, but there's been some jailing of journalists, and they have sort of their own separatist problem within the separatist enclave. But certainly compared to the rest of Somalia or most countries in the region, it is pretty stable. Sorry.
So I wonder, like, what so like a parlor game I sort of play with myself is when I see a map and it doesn't have a date on it, I sort of look to certain clues to see when the map might be built. Like if it was after 2002, there'd be like East Timor. If it was after 2011, there'd be Sudan. I'm looking at my map right now, and Zaire is still the name of the country we know now as DRC. And the USSR is prominently on there. But I'm thinking, so this map, it doesn't have a date on it, but it must have been from, I think probably like 1987, 1988, somewhere, because Yugoslavia is still its own country as well. Like 10 years from now, if I were to kind of look at a map from today, what changes might you expect to see on it?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, especially well, I guess by the time this airs, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump will have had their meeting, and the U.S. president has talked about how he kind of sympathizes with the Russian case for the annexation of Crimea, basically being that these are Russian speakers. Well, why shouldn't this be part of Russia? So I guess if I were to talk about a likely change, it might be the kind of eventual international acceptance of the annexation of Crimea by Russia. I don't see it in the near term, but I think sooner or later it's going to be kind of de facto recognized and maybe eventually legally recognized. I mean, if you want to talk about maps, another interesting place to look at is Taiwan. I mean, the government of China, of the People's Republic of China, has been putting sort of enormous pressure, not just on other governments, but on private companies, not to designate Taiwan as an independent country, or as semi-independent, or however it is they denote it. So I think there may, I'd say, I'd see it as more likely that we kind of see de facto recognition of Taiwan as Chinese territory. I'd say that's probably more likely than any of the countries I recognize in the book being recognized as independent. Another interesting issue to look at is the last chapter of the book, where I talk about climate change and its effect on small island states. One of the places I visited was a country called Kiribati. It's spelled like Kiribati, but it's pronounced Kiribati.
I've had the former president of Kiribati on the podcast, Anote Tong.
Oh, Anote Tong. Yeah, I spoke with him. Yeah, he's great. He's in the book.
Yeah.
I went to his house.
I called his house. That was an expensive call.
I can imagine.
for doing Skype, but it was great. It was a good interview, and like in your book, he talks about building contingencies against the prospect that his country might not exist in 10 years.
Yeah, and I guess what I was interested in when I went there is this idea of whether, if that happens, if the people of Kiribati have to move to, either to this land that Anote Tong purchased in Fiji, or to somewhere else. I mean, is the nation of Kiribati as a political unit still going to exist, even if the land doesn't? Normally our current legal definition of a state has to include a territory in addition to a government and citizens and all that. And I think that, if they're thinking now about whether there can be some kind of nationhood post facto, if the country is no longer inhabitable, it's going to be something that's sort of different than our current idea of what a nation is, and it might, I kind of talk in the book about sort of pre-modern ideas of nations that are going back to medieval kingdoms like Burgundy that moved in sort of different locations in Europe depending on family politics, or the Knights of Malta, who are this sort of weird anomaly who are recognized as semi-sovereign even though they don't control any territory. So there are these kind of oddball cases, but if Kiribati continues to be a country, even if people can no longer live there, it's not going to be anything like what we normally consider a country. And it's interesting because most of what I knew about the place came from coverage of Anote Tong's speeches at these climate conferences and his sort of purchase of land. But he's almost a bit of an outlier in politics when you get there. When you talk to most other Kiribati politicians, or to just sort of ordinary people who you meet there, they're not really thinking in these terms. I mean, I met very few people who are kind of making imminent plans for departure from their islands. I mean, I think that really, even though Kiribati is kind of held up as the canary in the coal mine or what have you, or the kind of global symbol of the coming dislocations due to climate change, I think people there have the same kind of reluctance to consider those consequences that the rest of us do.
Well, I was really excited to see your book. I've been excited about it ever since I read that article you wrote a few years ago about the CONIFA soccer tournament, and I absolutely encourage people to check it out. I'll post a link on the website. But thank you. Thanks for your time, Josh.
Thanks, Mark. Anytime.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Josh. That was great. One thing, big thank you also to everyone who is becoming a premium subscriber on this show. This entitles you to access bonus episodes, which I post fairly frequently. I actually have some good bonus content coming up pretty soon. It also entitles you to a complimentary subscription to my Don's Digest Global News Clip service. This is an email news roundup I send out every single morning about the most important, most relevant global news that was not necessarily going to be on the front page of the New York Times, but is nonetheless important for you as a global affairs nerd to know about to start your day. And it's Don's Digest is the name of the service, and it can be yours for free if you become a premium subscriber and contribute to the show. I so appreciate your support. I will see you next time. Bye.